There, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Carl Schmitt's uh, and we're focusing on legality and legitimacy. Today, we're reading chapter two. So let's look at chapter two. That's right. Just go right to it. Right. This is the way we do it. Chapter two: legality and the equal chance for achieving political power. Article 68 of the Weimar Constitution establishes parliamentary legislative state. So therefore, 68. So the Reich statutes are passed by the Reichstag, comprehending law and statute without relation to any content as the present conclusion of the transitory parliamentary majority corresponds to a purely functional manner of thinking. In this way, law, statute, and legality become neutral procedural mechanisms and voting procedures that are indifferent towards content of any sort and accessible to any substantive claim. So the idea here is that what happened is things like law, statute, and legality, all of this becomes a neutral procedural mechanism, and voting procedures that are indifferent to content and accessible to any substantive claim. Um, indeed, the parliamentary legislative state's concept of law inherently has a wide-ranging neutrality regarding the most varied content. But this concept of law must contain certain qualities, such as normative generalities, substantive definitiveness, and permanence. If it is not to support the legislative state at all, if it is to support legislative at all. In other words, in these things, the law, he's saying up there, right, need to have certain qualities, such as normative generality, substantive definitiveness, and permanence, if they're going to support the legislative state. So that he's above all, it may not be neutral towards itself and its own supposition. If the parliamentary body is made into a mere function of the general majority elections, and if its majority decisions constitute law, but without regard to the qualities of its members, and its disregard for any substantive requirement of law, then all guarantees of justice and reasonableness, along with the concept of law and legality itself, end in an internally consistent functionalist view without substantive and content that is rooted in arithmetic understandings of a majority. In other words, so therefore, what is he saying here? He's saying that if it is simply just going to, the nature of a majority is always going to change, he's going to say. And therefore, this is, if the whole basis by which what constitutes law merely depends on what any majority that happens to be says it is. Okay, makes it to be, and therefore all guarantee that the fact that the nature of majorities are so varying will mean that what law means will vary with those majorities, and therefore because that will mean what there's no. There's no all the guarantees of justice and reasonable along with the concept of law and legality itself, and in an internally consistent functionalism. They have a functionalist view, but the content of, but in other words, without substance and content, because of the nature of the mathematical reality of this. 51% produces the majority in parliament. 51% of the votes in parliament produces law and legality. 51% also demonstrate the confidence of parliament and produces parliamentary government. The method of will formulation through simple majority vote is sensible and acceptable when an essential similarity among the entire people can be assumed. For in this case, There is no voting. There is no voting down of the minority. Rather, the vote should only permit a latent and presupposed agreement and consensus to become evident. As noted, since every democracy rests on the presupposition of the individuality similar of the indivisibly similar entire unified people. For them, there is then, in fact, in essence, no minority, and still less a number of firm, permanent minorities. So, therefore, there's one homogeneous people. That this is that the democratic theory assumes that there's this, and therefore there's not going to be permanent minorities or no minorities, and still less firm and permanent minorities, right? The process of determining the majority comes into play, not because finding what is true and proper has been renounced on account of relativism or narcissism. That would be in the view of the momentous political decisions at issue here, a suicidal renunciation, and is possible, as Hen Kelsen said, concedes only only in relative peaceful times. Thus, only when it does not matter, right? That you can have such a view. In other words, when it does matter, you need to have that. In other words, such it would be a suicidal renunciation. In other words, if you had this kind of have renounced that count of relative narcissism, determining what the majority comes to play, not finding what is true and proper, has been renounced on account of relativism. That this process of determining the majority comes to play would be suicidal if it was not in peaceful times, right? But must assume that by virtue of being a part of the same people, all those similarly situated would, in essence, will the same thing. If the assumption of an indivisible national community is no longer tenable, then the abstract, empty functionalism or pure mathematical majority determinations is the opposite of neutrality and objectivity. So you can make the argument that there would be, if there's a homogeneous people where there's no, everyone agrees on things and everything like this, then the neutrality issue is not, in other words, relying on the simple majority is not it would be a kind of, what do you call, a function of neutrality and objectivity, right? As he said, explained a little bit minutes earlier about how that would work in that sense. That everyone having the same thing, and therefore the majority would just really reflect what would be a consensus position in that sense, right? But if there's not a real majority, if the population is not homogeneous, it's divided into very different groups who no longer see itself, right? Then this is not going to be that. It does not produce that, he says. In other words, if it is no longer tenable, then the abstract empty functionalism of pure mathematical majority does not produce a neutrality. It is only the qualitatively larger and smaller force subordination of the defeated and therefore suppressed minority. Okay, so therefore majority rule becomes the domination of the majority against the minority, right? The democratic identity of governing and governed, of those commanding and those obeying, stops. The majority commands and the minority must obey. Arithmetic calculation also stops because one can only reasonably produce a sum from that which is very similar. In other words, that the arithmetic idea that they have to be similar, you can only have a sum if everything's the same thing, right? One can, I think we have some smoke coming in, something. One can designate the functionalism of shifting majorities, lacking both content and presuppositions, only as dynamism. So only can one can describe the functionalism of shifting majorities lacking both content and presupposition only as dynamism, although the lack of stasis and of substance actually still does not yet need anything dynamic, right? You can say it's dynamic, this shifting of this is dynamicism, but though the lack of stasis, now is the stasis frozenness? I think stasis here is lack of, not stasis in the Greek conception of conflict, but rather stasis here is everything being still and things, and of any substance in it, right? Actually, still does not yet need anything dynamic, right? But when one perfects this substantive, indifferent, and neutral process even more, and takes it to the absurdity of only a mathematical statistical majority determination, the substantive principle of justice will nevertheless always still have to be the presupposition if one wishes to keep the entire system of legality from collapsing immediately. In other words, it still has to be the principle. In other words, since the majority produces the law, and the law should be what is just, right? The embodiment of justice. Therefore, the idea here is that this is the formalist conception of it, right? The form of this is that this is the reason why this is the formal procedural aspect of this, right? And he says here that therefore, if you if one wishes to keep the entire system of legality from collapsing immediately, right? In other words, that no one believes that this is the law, that this is the law that we should obey, because rather it's only the will of the majority rather than the will, and this it's unjust, right? Um, the principle that is there is an unconditional equal chance for all conceivable opinions, tendencies, and movements to achieve a majority. So everyone has the right to achieve the majority, because we're not gonna do this. But then what about if the majority comes in and what they want? This is the problem, right? Without this principle, majority calculus would be a gross game, grotesque game. Without this principle, that okay, in other words, unconditional equal chances, right? Without this principle, majority calculus would be a grotesque game, not merely because it's indifferent towards every substantive result. In other words, it's not only because it's indifferent to the result. The concept of legality derives from this principle would also be a shameless mockery of all justice. In other words, it makes justice really arbitrary to the will of the majority, right? But this system and the principle also be would also sorry, but with this system, the principle would already come to an end after the first majority is achieved, because that majority would immediately establish itself as a permanent legal power. Preserving the ability of the principle of equal chances cannot be read out of the parliamentary legislative state. In other words, preserving the ability of the principle of which cannot be read out of the parliamentary legislative state. It remains the principle of justice and an existentially necessary maxim of self-preservation. So, what it's saying here that already said the majority be achieved because the majority would immediately establish itself as the ruling power. Thus, preserving the ability of the principle of equal chances cannot be read out of the parliamentary legislative. In other words, it is essential party of it, right? He's saying here, and it remains the principle of justice. So equal chances is the view of justice, right? And the existentially necessary maxim of the preservation of that system. And also, thoroughly settled functionalism of purely mathematical majorities cannot renounce this indispensable presupposition in the foundation of its legality. So, therefore, this is the problem that that there is a implicit. This idea of equal chances is an implicit, fundamental structure justifying this democratic legislative state, right? Without it, the system doesn't work. It doesn't. It's the principle that guides it. It makes the justice of the system just. Um, The problem, and without, if this breaks down, if it's now the question is what happens when but then it can do what it wants. What the parliament can say, well, no, we're going to change that. We're not going to. We're going to no, right? That state power is legal. That state power is legal. Should above all eliminate and negate every right to resistance as law, right? So therefore, since the state power is legal, you should not resist it. But the ancient problem of resistance against tyrant remains. That is, resistance against injustice and misuse of state power. And the functionalist, formalistic howling out of the parliamentary legislative state is not able to resolve it. So therefore, if you howl out the thing by making it just purely everyone has equal chances like this argument, doesn't resolve the question. Therefore, Schmitt basically raises that the old position of resistant tyranny is still there. It's not. This is Schmitt is. This is hardly Nazi. I mean, I don't see this argument being a Nazi. I think this is very consistent both with Hobbes and Locke in this sense, um, um, in this fundamental sense that they're still there. That once you have he is kind of struggling at one level. This is more Locke than Hobbes in one sense, and actually more, maybe a little bit more even pre Machiavelli in the sense, the ancient, and that's why he uses the word ancient problem, right? And that the howling, in other words, doesn't resolve this ancient problem, right? This leads only to a concept of legality that is substantively non-committal, neutral in a way that undermines its own validity and dismissive of all substantive justice. Well, that's very dangerous, right? The emptiness of the mere majority calculus deprives legality of all persuasive power. This is important. The emptiness of the majority calculus, that any majority can do it, right? Deprives legality of all persuasive power. Actually, this is a very powerful argument that against Schmitt here would kind of attack parliamentary majoritarianism in that sense. This is the danger of it. If you're having an argument that is based upon in other words, the neo-positive, particularly how he's if you had the problem is he's pointing out that this is not a general principle. I think we have to understand this. What he's doing here is looking at the particular aspects of the Weimar Constitution with the assumptions and the theoretical assumptions inherited by many of the founders and supporters of the Constitution for this value neutral conception of this, this. And he's showing the contradictions of this and why this is problematic and why it's going to break down, why it is in the crisis that it is. And why it's going to break down in a fundamental sense. In other words, its neutrality, first of all, is neutrality towards the difference between justice and injustice. The possibility of injustice, the possibility of the tyrant, is eliminated from the world only through a formal sleight of hand, namely, only by no one calling injustice injustice and tyrant tyrant. Much of as one eliminates war from the world by terminating it peaceful measures accompanied by battle of greater or lesser scope, and designating what is purely juristic conception, and designating what is purely a juristic definition of war. So in other words, he's mocking this idea. In other words, that this is a very much attack on the positivist, neo-positivist / neo-Kantian position here, or the kind of quasi deluded neo-Kantian position of the positivists. And he's arguing that, listen, the kind that shaped the kind of Weimar Constitution, because he says that you've just basically eliminated injustice by saying that justice is not, in other words, by no longer calling injustice injustice, no tyrant a tyrant. In the same way that they've eliminated war by calling it, what he says here, this kind of, right? By conceptual necessity, then legal power can simply no longer do injustice, right? Just by conceptual necessity, the law can never do injustice. The old teaching of a right to resistance distinguishes among two types of tyrants: he who arrives at the seat of power in a legal manner, but who exercises the abuse of exercises and abuse power badly and tyrannically. That is the tyrant in executo. So the tyrant. Let's look at this Latin, right? Yeah, from exercise. The tyrant from exercise versus the tyrant without title. Title. Let's see. A tyrant without title. Without the title. So in other words, it's this kind of tyrant who is a person who does it legally but then abuses it. Further, the tyrant in title who achieves power without legal title and and is indifferent as to whether it exercises power well or badly. Under the substantive neutrality or under the utter substantive emptiness of the functional conceptual concept of legality, there can be no longer there can no longer be the sort of the first sort of tyrant in particular, the illegal use of legal power. However, the tyrant without legal title, right, could never occur. So it can, if the majority attain full title, lawful title to the legal possession of power. So therefore, in other words, it could never occur. This system, this logic of this system, prevents the possibility of the second occurrence, but denies the possibility of the first two types of tyrants. Right. Again, this is amazing for Schmitt, I think, because Schmitt is, what Schmitt is doing here is actually how is this Nazi? How is this this can be argued as pro-Nazi? He's really taking a hammer to the argument, maybe, and in fact, this might be a book, and this is written in the 30s, so during the height of the crisis, the rise of the Nazis. We have to remember he was at this time trying to convince Hindenburg to utilize powers to crush the Nazis. Okay, he was in favor of an anti-Nazi, a right-wing anti-Nazi coalition. Okay, um, um, only he who exercises state or state-like power without the 51% majority on their side is illegal, is illegal and a tyrant. Whoever has this majority would no longer do injustice, but rather everything he does is transformed into justice and equality. With such consequences, the principle of a functional concept of law without without content, carries itself ad absurdum. A kind of ad absurdum, something that goes to absurdity, carries itself to absurdity. It carries itself to absurdity. The claim to legality renders every rebellion and countermeasure an injustice and a violation of legality. And this is how liberals think. This is why this argument is that, in many ways, what he's saying is that the liberal mind and the liberal state looks at people who rebel in one sense as whether, in other words, this is funny. This is very selective. They would say that these people who are acting, you know, I would find it very funny. That Antifa is not rebelling. What Antifa and crazies like that are not rebel or Black Lives Matter, and that they are regime supporters. They reflect the majority's opinion, and therefore the argument goes of those who control the political system. So that they do nothing wrong. What they do is not unjust or wrong, but the people who we say are are acting. In other words, these other people who are not doing what we say should be done. Uh, 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 okay, that's interesting. Therefore, there is a kind of weird aspect of this in the present, right? The claims of legality renders every rebellion and countermeasure of injustice and legal violation or illegality renders every measure of an injustice. In other words, the claim to legality renders every rebellion and measure a legal violation or illegality. If legality and illegality can be arbitrary at the disposal of a majority, then the majority can, above all, declare the domestic competitors illegal. That is, hors la loi, hors la loi. Is that French or is that? I think it's French. That's French. Mm. Hors to them. That is outside the law. Outside the law, thereby excluding them from the democratic homogeneity of the people. What is the law? Law. That's right. Outside the law, regulating the democratic homogeneity of the people. Whoever controls 51% would be able legally to render the remaining 49% illegal. The majority would be permitted to use legal means to close the door to legality, through which they themselves entered, and to treat partisan opponents like common criminals, who are then reduced to kicking their boots against the locked door. With this troubling possibility in view, one attempts today to ensure a certain protection, mostly through the introduction of a threshold requirement and qualifications of voting majorities, demanding for selected issues of a two-thirds and similar majority, a two-thirds and similar majorities. Issues a two-thirds and similar majorities. On the one hand, and gives protections against 51% majorities and the misleading slogans of minority guarantees. But then on the other hand, one adheres to the empty functionalism of the mere arithmetic majority and majority calculations. The following chapter will show that the introduction of such numerically qualified those the sorry will show the introduction of such numerically qualified majority calculus also devalues and destroys democracy as well as parliamentary legislative state and its concept of legality. So the concept of this indeed, it is already evident that this mathematical functionalism of a transient majority calculus continually undermines itself when the principle of equal chance of achieving a majority is not strictly observed. The parliamentary legislative state, which today rests on the rule of temporary majorities, can deliver the monopoly of the legal exercise of power to the majority parties and can demand that the minorities renounce the right to resistance only so long as equal chance of achieving majority really remains open, and this assumption of its principle of justice is somehow still believable. In other words, you can only maintain the system if you believe equal chances are alive. Because then, if you don't, then there's people going to say, "Oh, there's not. This is unjust. What their rule is unjust, and we can resist it." Exercise and renounce, ignore the law, right? If you have equal chances, um, uh, um, then you cannot renounce the law, and whatever anyone who renounces the law is a criminal and needs the full force of law can get it. But if people don't, it has to be widely believed that anyone who could win, could become the majority, could win. If everyone does not believe that's possible, then people then no longer see this as illegal resistance, right? But it becomes legal. Most of what has been presented to justify majority rule is traceable to this principle, especially what the single available monograph, Starosloski, 1916, right, on the subject has to say about the indispensable exchange of personal composition, the indispensable exchange in the personal composition of majority, or the necessary indeterminacy of its rule. In his famous book about the theory of the state, a theory of the estate-based right to existence, Kerr Wonsendorf, in 1915, grounded and justified the elimination of the right to resistance in reference to the introduction of an ordered system of courts or of dispute resolution. So, therefore, that this was the estate-based right of the older system that a right to resistance that was previously based was rendered obsolete. In other words, as rendered what is just rendered obsolete or made no longer necessary by the fact you had an order system of courts and dispute resolution. Much more important, however, for the parliamentary legislative state, that the establishment of a system of legal protections or the preservation of chance for trial before established courts is the maintenance of equal chance to achieve the majority, which means political power. So not only two principles has to be stated, not only chance to a trial before a court, right, but also equal chances to achieve a majority, which means achieving political power. For when a party controlling 51% of lawmaking body can legally set definite statutes for the judiciary, then it also dictates to the judiciary the contents of the judge's decision for civil law, labor law and criminal law, civil law, and all other types of legal disputes, because judges are obliged to enforce statutes. Moreover, the parties with 51% control all the legislative forms of the government, which has at its hand the means of state power involved in legal application. Thus, the equal chance at judicial solution, a judicial solution, is the non-dominant party. In other words, for the non-dominant party itself, party for the non-dominant party, right, transforms itself into the opposite of such a chance, right? Whosoever has the majority makes the valid statutes. Moreover, those in the majority themselves enforce the statutes they make. They have a monopoly over the validity of statutes and the execution, as well as the production and sanctity of legality. Moreover, more important, most important, however, is the monopoly over the enforcement of valid statutes confers. Okay, I just had a little bit of a because there's something coming in outside. I have to. My wife took the fan away, and because she took the fan away, all of a sudden the air is kind of like. Um, um, thus, let's get rid of whoever has the majority makes the valid statute. Moreover, those in the majority themselves enforce the statutes they make. Right, they have the monopoly over the validity of statutes and the execution, as well as over the production of and sanction of legality. More important, however, is that the monopoly over the enforcement of valid statutes confers on those in the majority legal possession of state means of power, and with it a political power that extends far beyond that over the mere validity of norms. The ruling party can make use of the advantage, which comes along with the mere possession of the legal means of power in a state type dominated by this form of legality. So in other words, now this is interesting. He's going to be saying that the nature of the Weimar Constitution produced the Nazis in that sense, or any party authoritarian situation, because the reality was that as long as the majority had to believe in the things, but the majority didn't believe in these things, didn't believe in equal chances and this stuff, they had the means to basically destroy their minority. So therefore, this is not defending the Nazis. Here is not a defense or justification arguing what should be done, but saying that because of how this system and constitutional form is, this is a possibility. This happens. This will happen. This could happen. This is happening in that sense, right? Dominated by this new form, the majority is now suddenly no longer a party. It is the state itself. And actually, this is. I think now I understand why Schmitt, if he thinks this, right, he thinks this form is the reality of the party. Then, after the enabling act, this party is now the state. Is legal. In other words, it is the state itself. The state, as Otto Meyer once said, that which is without limits breaking through the norms in which the legislative state and statutory applications bind themselves, however narrow and limited these sets of norms may be. So there was in the state, that which is without limits breaks through the norms. Therefore, the state was without limits; it breaks through the norms, in which the legislative state and statutory applications bind themselves. However narrow and limited those sets of norms may be. So those norms are narrow and limited. But the state, therefore, the mere possession of state power produces an additional political surplus, apart from the power that is merely normative and legal, a super legal premium on the lawful possession of legal power, and on the achievement of the majority that lies beyond any normative consideration. So therefore, there's no normative consideration here. In other words, the majority is the majority. There's no norm that justifies the majority in that sense, a consideration. It holds the power, and because it holds the power, it defines what is legal, the law, the statute, because it can make whatever statute it wants. It then therefore has, and then the statutes are what the law says, and therefore what the judges must obey, and therefore they also have the power, the means to enforce the law against their opposition and those who oppose it. This political premium is relatively calculable and peaceful in normal times. In abnormal times, it is entirely incalculable and unpredictable. It always has a threefold character. It emerges first from the concrete interpretation and the use of undetermined and evaluated concepts such as public security and order, danger, emergency, necessary measures, hostility to the state and constitution, peaceful disposition, life and death issues, etc. So in other words, it emerges. In other words, it has threefold character. The first is that it emerges first from. In other words, these problems will emerge from these issues, right? Public security and order, danger, emergency, necessary measures, hostile to the state and constitution, peaceful disposition, life and death issues, etc. Such concepts, without which no state type could survive, are distinctive in that they are bound directly to the momentary situation, that they receive their specific content initially through concrete application, and most of all, that their concrete application and execution are alone decisive in all difficult and politically important times. So this is the first issue. that these things, the question of public safety, the danger, emergency, these things are what? These are things, if you don't address, the state will not survive. In other words, these are things that are no state could survive without these things. And therefore, and are distinctive in that they're bound directly to the moment, and they're bound to the direct of the momentary situation, the content, the situation here, right? Um, and initially through concrete application, and most of all, their concrete application and executions are alone decisive in all difficult and political important times. So therefore, in political important times, these decisions are going to be essential. Second, the legal holders of state power has the presumption of legality on his side in all hard cases. In other words, the legal holders of state power has the presumption of legality on his side in hard cases, which, of course, with such indeterminate concepts, one always encounters a difficult political circumstance and difficult political circumstances. Now, in other words, those things, those who hold the power, what they decide is legal, legitimate, legal and legitimate in that sense, right? This is that second thing, right? That legal holders of state power has presumably the legality on his side in such hard cases. But this is, however, in difficult situations, with such these indeterminate concepts, in other words, these concepts that depend upon the context of situation, are difficult. Are what encounters in difficult circumstances. Right? Difficult circumstances, it's going to be indefinite. We're not going to have definite situations. Right? Finally, third, even in cases of doubtful legality, the directors of the legal holders of state power are directly executable in the immediate instance, even when opportunities for legal challenge and judicial protections are provided. So, therefore, no, you can still execute it. Now, even when they're illegal, even though there may be that, they're still going to be executed now, right? In a race between the executive and judiciary, the judiciary will mostly arrive too late, even if one provided it power of issuing measures and rulings for use in political cases that are valid only temporarily under certain conditions and in a single instant, and that therefore are themselves not unquestionable instruments. So therefore, in other words, in the contest between judiciary and executive, this is going to get first. It's going to be second. And the only way to do this is to give the judiciary mechanisms. In other words, what do you call it? He says this is important. I mean, this is like writs in the Anglo-Saxon where we have this writs, cease and desist, stop. But today we have oh yeah, we're going to ignore it. We're going to ignore it. So not only the issue read, but also a means to enforce it. The problem with the judiciary is how you're going to enforce it. They depend on the executive for enforcement. So if the executive is not willing, the Justice Department is not willing to enforce what a judge does, ignores it, then this is the thing, the impotence of judicial power in that sense, right? But he says that provided that the words is too late, even if one provided the power of issuing measures and rulings in these cases that are only valid temporarily under certain things and in an instant, and therefore to themselves not unquestionably instrument. Consequently, the judicial chance signifies, in effect, a necessary corrective and a protection that one should not dismiss. But it cannot be politically decisive and cannot alone support this type of legal principle of justice. And the preservation of the equal chance. In other words, it cannot be the basis. The fact that you can go to the court to challenge it cannot be the good enough justification, because that's too. In other words, it will be too short, and added to the current German legal conscientiousness, sharpened through many foreign experiences, is the fact that judicial procedures for resolving political conflicts have generally lost value and standing. In none of the life and death questions of German foreign policy, as things stand today, could one still imprudently insist on the opportunity to win an international law case affirming Germany's death penalty. In other words, you couldn't, in the international law, you could not handle it. Everything thus hinges on the principle of equal chance to win domestic political power. If principle is no longer defended, then one gives up on the parliamentary legislative state itself. So if the principle is no longer defended, then one gives up on the parliamentary legislative state itself. It's justice and legality. You give up on. In this regard, however, our goodwill and the best intentions. Okay. In this regard, however, our goodwill and best intentions of much use. In other words, in this situation, is goodwill and intentions enough? Intentions and the best intentions and goodwill, is this good enough? Every critical movement, every critical moment engenders the principle of equal chance. Endangers the principal moment endangers the principle of equal chance because it reveals the inevitable opposition between the premium on legal possession of power and the preservation of availability of the equal chance for achievement for domestic political power. So therefore, there's the inevitable opposition between the premium of legal possession of power and the preservation of chance for to achieve domestic political power. These two things are in opposition. On the one hand, equal chances is already eliminated through the mere supposition of the legality of every state expression of state authority. So on the one hand, equal chances are already eliminated through the mere supposition of the legality of every expression of state authority. On the other hand, no legal state power can do without this supposition. On the other hand, part of the essential content of the principle of equal chance is that its concrete interpretation and its use is not one-sided, but rather that it is taken up by all parties under full legal equity. In other words, all parties must have this in full legal equity. On the one hand, the concept like equal chance itself is again one of those indispensable concepts tied directly to a specific situation, whose interpretation and proper use is necessary a matter of legal power. Therefore, of the legal power, therefore of the present ruling party. In other words, this concept of equal chance again becomes one of those indeterminate concepts because it depends on all the parties upholding this principle. Right? Everyone has to uphold this belief that this is a principle upholding. What happens if I think, as long as I'm in a minority, I think this is okay, but once I'm a majority, I think, oh, this is not. Okay, you understand? This is the problem, right? And the proper necessary legal a matter of legal power, therefore, of the present ruling party. On its own initiative, the ruling party determines what possibilities for action it permits domestic opposition, right? In this way, the ruling party decides when the illegality of competitors commence. Obviously, that is no longer equal competition and no longer an equal chance. So therefore, once this happens, and therefore I determine what the law is, and I determine what becomes legal and illegal, and therefore this basically underdoes the idea of equal chance, right? That no longer equal competition and no longer equal chance. Obviously, the principle of equal chance is of such sensitivity that any serious doubt about the loyalty of all participants already renders the principle application impossible. So if there's any doubt, in other words, if there's any doubt of any participants, any parties not believe in this makes the application impossible. For it is self-evident that one can hold open an equal chance only for those whom it is certain would do the same. So this sounds right as Locke. This this comes really right from Locke in his famous his piece on work on treatise on tolerance, why he says he believes that he defends the argument of a toleration for most groups, but he says Catholics who deny tolerance should not be tolerated. Right? He denies it to Catholics because Catholics deny the principle of equal chance in this way. So therefore, any party we should. This is Locke's. I think this is what Schmitt is kind of. Schmitt is kind of repeating the Lockean doctrine here. Uh, uh, um, due to and any and other use of such principle would not only be suicide in practical terms, but also an offense against the principle itself. So therefore, like this, you understand that principle, right? Due to this necessity, the party in legal possession of power, by virtue of its hold on the means of state power, must itself determine and judge every concrete and politically important application and use of the concept of legality and illegality. That is its inevitable right. So therefore, in other words, that this is the reality of state power. State power will give to that the ruling party the power to make this. The legislative state gives this to the ruling party the right to decide what this question. Right? They make the things. They, in other words, they determine. Due to the necessity of the party in legal possession, by virtue of its hold on the means of state power, must determine and judge every concrete political important application and use of the concept of legality and legality. That is its inevitable right. However, it is just as much an inevitable right of the minority seeking to gain possession of the state means of power on the basis of its claim to an equal chance with full legal equality to render judgments itself over not only merely its own concrete legality and illegality, but also over that of the opposing party in control of the means of state power. So the principle of equal chance does not contain in its own inner assumption an answer to the question that arises at critical moments, and is the only decisive question in practical terms. In a case of conflict, who removes doubt and resolves differences of opinions? In other words, doesn't answer this. In other words, he just gave an example. If everyone's equal chances, then therefore, what is true about the majority, the minority will have similar equal right in that sense. To understand, to judge the legality and legality of this, and the principle of this legislative entity, right? And therefore and if they disagree, then there's no belief in the equal chance anymore, right? And that's gone. And that one will believe that the other one is acting illegally. In other words, one will believe he's acting illegally, and the other one will believe he's acting. Likewise, the opposite. The other one thinks it's acting illegally, while the other one thinks it's acting illegally. So therefore, this is the breakdown of this is the dispute, right? And what is the way to resolve this? Who resolves the doubt? Who can do it? Precisely for the proper use of the previous mentioned indeterminate concepts. Those remember safe, security, betrayal. Let's go back up here, all the way up here, right? It's public security and order, danger, emergency, necessary measures, hostility to the state and constitution, peacefulness, and life and death issues. These issues, what would be the solution? Let's read this. Precisely for the proper use in previous mentioned determinate concepts that are tied to particular situations, such as public order, hostility to the state, or constitutional peace, or the Constitution, peaceful or not, but above all, also legal or illegal attitudes. An essential part of the equal chance is that ruling and non-ruling parties, majorities or minorities, have unconditional parity, right, in regard to this. A practical remedy would be to seek a solution in the introduction of an impartial third party who decides the conflict, whether judiciary or otherwise, right? So the third party should do it. But the solution would be, let's create a third party, right? Okay. But the system of legality of the parliamentary legislative states would be betrayed, right? Because then why? Because it would create, and there was that creation of one. The second you create that third party who will become the decider, this will destroy the legality of the parliamentary legislative state. For one, for in contrast to the parties of the dispute, that this third party would be the super parliamentary, indeed, super democratic higher third, and the political will no longer come about through a free competition among political parties, which have fundamentally the same chances for power. The problem stemming from the principle of equal chance would not be solved through the principle itself. In other words, it's not going to be solved by it. Would rather only be acknowledged that the principle merely leads to an irresolvable question in critical situation. As soon as this assumption, so essential for this system of as soon as the assumption so essential for the system of legality collapses, specifically that of legal disposition held equally, the legal disposition held equally on all sides, then there is no longer a remedy. The majority party in legal control of the means of state power must assume that the opposing party, when it achieves power legally, will use legal means in order to ensconce itself in possession of power, and to close the door behind it, hence legally eliminating the principle of legality itself. The minority seeking power maintains the ruling majority maintains that the ruling majority has long done the same, without whether explicit or implicit. Right, the minority is on its own declaring the existing state power illegal, which no legal power can permit. So at the critical juncture, each denounces the other, with both playing the guardian of legality and the guardian of the Constitution. The result is a condition without legality or Constitution. So therefore, the parties like this, both declaring the other one illegal, therefore there is no legality and there is no Constitution. Each one claims that they are the guardians of what is the law and the guardians of this. Jeez. With every concept of so-called political right, which rests on legal equality and harmonization, one such critical moment can appear. In other words, concepts involving foreign policy and international law, such as security, danger of war or invasion, threat, attack, war guilt, and etc., recognize the same sort of dialectic. For example, in the so-called war ban clause of the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, several powers explicitly made the reservation that every violation of the pact relieves other states of their treaty obligations towards the aggressor. That is not an inappropriate reservation. It is actually self-evident. But one see immediately that the pact becomes worthless for the critical cases as which it was directed, specifically the case of war, at least so long as the pact is applied with unconditional legal equality. And, for example, so long as an imperialistic great power or group of power plays the higher third and itself interprets and sanctions the intermediate concepts of the part, including especially the concept of war, which is likely to occur in political reality. So there was a defines what war is. This other party will determine whether what something is a conflict that is a war or not, right? In domestic political terms, however, an innocuous concrete decision regarding the irresolvable acrimony may be achieved through the party in possession of legal power. In other words, they can declare this. In other words, that they can at this moment the party becomes the higher third, and in the same moment eliminates the principle of its legality, the equal chance. In other words, the advantage of legal possession of state power decides the case. Whoever has the power, the legal possession of power determines the case. So therefore, he uses this case and argues that the higher international body controlled by these powers will determine what is war and what's not war. This is the same thing. This is a case of conflict, civil war, or civil strife, that the power holding the state will declare what is civil strife and breaking of law. Okay, the threefold great premium on the legal possession of power is grounded in the ease of judgment, the supposition of legality, and the ability to achieve the immediate execution of one dictates. So again, back to those three things, right? Each one of these rests is about what? This is his kind of like summing of what each one meant. Each one of those things meant that the is grounded on the ease of judgment, the supposition of legality, and the ability for immediate execution of one's dictates. Its entire primary effect eliminates any thought of the equal chances and becomes manifest in the proper use of extraordinary powers in the state of the exception. So therefore, again, I think he is referring to, in other words, the state of exception crisis. Again, I think he's very much relying on his work dictatorship here on this, and also what he said earlier in concept of the political here, right? The exception, the extra, in other words, extraordinary powers in the state of exception. Eliminate because this situation eliminates the question of equal chances. Moreover, the premium provides the premium of these principles, right? The great premium on legal possession of power, right? This premium provides the ruling party control not only over the plunder or the spoils, as it is traditionally known, but also over the gross domestic product that is bound up with the taxing and spending power in a qualitative total state, right? So therefore, it's in other words, in the qualitative total state, this is in other words not only the spoils but also the overall product, the possibilities of this, right? It is enough to suggest this side of legal possibilities in order to recognize its effect on the legal principle of the parliamentary legislative state. A number of smaller premiums should be added to the larger one. For elections and votes of the next election period, for example, a majority party can alter the election law rules to its advantage and to disadvantage its domestic political competitors. The majority party can act like the slim majority of the Prussian legislature in the decision of April 12, 1932, at the end of the election period, with I think that's an add-on later, right? With the help of a change in order of business for 23. So no, it's written after this event. So, it's written after this event, so therefore 1932 after this event. With the help of the change in order in the order of business for the following election period, its intention rendered the choice of a minister president more difficult, in order to take an opportunity away from its opponents and improve its own chances for the continuation for legal possession of power despite no longer having the majority. The caretaker governments, which today in several countries last months, even years, often offer an especially illuminating example of this of the type of premium from holding power that is of interest here. These caretaker governments settle not only all current business, as the Prussian constitution prescribes. For example, rather one reads all business simply one reads simply all business instead of continuing business. First, because one relies on the okay, this is going to be one of those big German words. Hold on. And it's probably going to be what doesn't come on here. Hold on. Yeah. Okay, state court. Okay, I checked that out. The the stat court, Gericht of Recht, soft. So, because you run these Germans are like these nasty words. You get they make a word and instead of having a land or stat. This is state court. Relies on the state court, which refuses to clarify the distinction, but also because it is difficult for one with a disloyal disposition to distinguish between continuing and other business. Right? What is continuing with other business? In other words, this is the problem, right? This is the problem. The court would come in here, and the court would say, "Well, but it's partisan in that sense, and therefore, what is continuing is going to make it difficult." A new business, right? And also, for these reasons, in regard to its power, but not its limitations, one places the caretaker government completely at the same level as a duly constituted parliamentary cabinet. So a formally ruling majority without current majority support remains in possession of the means of state power to the extent that the opposition party did not win for itself a clear counter-majority. Obviously, the inner justification then is no longer the majority principle, but still only the factual possession of state power once it has been gained legally. The equal chance is no longer valid, but it is still only the triumph of the beast possible. Okay, this is going to be a pain in the ass. It's a legal word. May you be happy. The triumph of may you be happy. That's just possible. But this Beatus This is one of those. Yeah, being happy. Okay, yes, I'm sorry. I didn't always make that clear. In the same degree to which such premiums on possession of power retain a defining political meaning, and their ruthless exploitation becomes a self-evident means of partisan power maintenance. The principle of equal chances loses its persuasiveness and consequently its foundation in the legality of the parliamentary legislative state. So therefore, this is, in other words, that the reality of these governments, these caretaker governments, are they hold legal power, and therefore the equal chances is no longer valid, but rather still triumphs of be happy. They have the power. They can be, like you got the power, you got the power. In the same degree to which such premiums on the possession of power retain the defining principle, political meaning, right? Those who have power retain a defining political meaning, and their ruthless exploitation becomes a self-evident means of partisan power maintenance. The principle of change loses its persuasiveness, and consequently, its foundation in the legality of the. In other words, it's no longer the legal principle of the parliamentary legal state. Now, when things really have gone that far, it ultimately comes down to who holds the reins of power at the moment, when the entire system of legality is thrown aside, and when power is constituted on a new basis. So, therefore, in other words, when it breaks down, it depends on who's in power. So, that's actually a scary thing in that sense, right? So there we end. This is the end of the chapter. We'll stop here. If you have any comments or questions, please put them below, and I will respond to them when I see them. If you like, again, interruptions. As I said, any questions, please put them down. When I see them, I'll do them. If you liked it, like it. Hit the like button. Share it with a friend. Share it on social media. And if you have not subscribed, please subscribe, or get your friends to subscribe, and get your friends to subscribe, and tell them about the channel, get it growing, and maybe encourage people to subscribe. If you didn't like it, you can always hit the thumbs down button, but say why in the comments, and maybe this way we can learn. Maybe I can improve. Maybe you're going to resolve your problem. Another thing is, if you want to follow me, those of you who wish to follow me on social media, the links are below. I'm sorry if my eyes are changing towards you, so I'm not looking at you, so sorry about that. I should change the camera a little, camera out. I'll maybe try to change the camera occasionally. Let's do it now, because we're done with this, right? So, what is the basic thrust of what's going left? If those of you who want to help what I do, you can Patreon, subscribe star there. You can always send me money. Because it helped, right? This is the joke about this. I know, but you're doing it anyways. Why should be a sucker? You're giving it away free anyways. You're not giving us premium content and blah 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 blah. I'm sorry. I mean, this is I try to do what I do, and it'd be nice if some people help, but it would be great. It would make my life a little easier. It needs to be easier, but okay, that's it. Another way you can do it is by buying a book or one of my books that are available below. Okay, take care in that sense. These again, Tuesdays, Thursdays. Usually posted Tuesdays, Thursdays. I know you're back in time, and that doesn't matter. They're there in the list. They're found in the playlist of reading called Schmitt, right? And then Mondays and Wednesdays we're still kind of doing. I think we're still kind of doing. Yeah, we're still kind of doing. Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws, and then Monday, Wednesday, Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws, and Tuesday, Thursday, these Schmitt things, and Friday, messing around and or a live stream. I can do a live stream. Okie dokie. Well, take care and have a good day. See you later. Bye bye.